The morning arrived quietly, as mornings often do in the wilderness, gradually, without fanfare. The fire from the night before had dwindled into a few faint embers, barely glowing in the early light. Ben woke first, his eyes blurry from a restless night of fitful dreams that were more like fragmented memories of his life before the jungle. He didn't remember when he had fallen asleep, but now that his eyes were open, he couldn't ignore the weight of his surroundings. The forest around them was eerily still, as if waiting for something, waiting for him to make a decision. The older man had disappeared during the night. Ben had half expected him to be gone when he woke up, but the silence felt different now. The absence of the man's steady presence was more unsettling than Ben had anticipated. The stranger had not been up yet either, his form still curled in the small space he'd claimed by the fire. Ben felt the gravity of his situation like a lead weight pressing against his chest. Everything in the past few days had led up to this moment, a fragile decision that could change everything. He had seen what the jungle could do to a person, how it twisted them, bent them to its will, and yet there was a sense that, in the older man's absence, it was somehow less dangerous, as if he had been the force holding them here. Ben hadn't trusted the older man, and part of him had always felt that he was meant to be just another victim of his harsh survival tactics. But that didn't mean the forest would leave them unscathed. Ben stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that made it feel like the trees were alive, breathing in and out. He turned to the stranger, who had now stirred awake, eyes blinking open. There was no word exchanged at first, no greeting, no acknowledgement of the passing of yet another night. They both knew there was no time for pleasantries anymore. Where did he go? Ben asked, his voice still rough from the silence of the night. The stranger sat up slowly, running a hand through his unkempt hair. His eyes were tired, but there was an edge to them, a sharpness that spoke of years spent surviving by watching every move, every shift in the air. He left, the stranger said, his voice low. He's gone. And it's not the first time. Ben frowned. He's been out here alone for how long? A long time, the stranger answered, his gaze distant. This place, it doesn't let go of you so easily. Once you're here, you're stuck in its grip. Some fight it, some get lost in it. He's one of the ones who learned to live with it. Ben felt a chill as he absorbed the stranger's words. The older man had learned to live with the forest, to become part of it in a way Ben could never truly understand. But that kind of life came with its own price. There were consequences to surviving like that, and Ben wasn't sure he wanted to know what they were. The air between them thickened, and for a moment, the unspoken tension weighed down on them both. There was still so much they didn't know, and the more they learned about the jungle and the people who lived in it, the less they understood. We can't stay here, the stranger said suddenly, breaking the silence with a sharp finality. If he's gone, then it's time to go. We can't afford to get stuck here, too. Ben hesitated. It wasn't that simple, not for him. There was something haunting about this place, something that gnawed at his soul. He'd seen the way the older man had lived with the forest, bending to its rhythms, becoming something else entirely. And part of Ben was afraid that, if they left, they would never truly escape it. You're right, Ben said after a long pause. But where do we go from here? The whole jungle's the same. We can't just wander aimlessly. The stranger stood, dusting off his pants with a swift motion, then looking out toward the dense canopy. His face was grim, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. You don't wander, the stranger said with a hint of bitterness in his voice. You follow the path. That's the only way out. Ben blinked, confused. The path? What path? The stranger didn't answer immediately. He took a long, slow look at the clearing, his eyes scanning every inch of their surroundings as though he was reading the forest like an open book. Then, finally, he spoke again. "There's a way out. People who've survived out here, those who don't get lost to the forest, who make it past the hunger, the cold, the madness, they know. They find it. They know the signs." Ben's heart quickened. "Signs?" The stranger nodded once, sharply. "Yeah. There's a pattern. A trail that leads out of this nightmare. But it's not easy to see. It's there, but you have to be paying attention, or it'll pass you by." The idea of leaving the jungle, of escaping the constant dread that had gnawed at him for so long, was tempting. But Ben knew the jungle had a way of showing you what it wanted you to see. The older man had spoken of a price for survival, and Ben wasn't sure if this path the stranger spoke of was another illusion, another trap. Still, something inside him urged him to try. "We follow the path." Then, Ben said, his voice resolute. "But we do it carefully. We don't trust the forest to show us anything." The stranger gave a slight nod of approval, his eyes narrowing as if sizing up Ben. Careful is the only way to survive out here. They packed their few belongings in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. There were no grand farewells to the jungle, it didn't deserve that kind of reverence. They left the small camp behind, the remnants of their fire still smoldering weakly in the earth. Ben couldn't help but glance back, wondering if it was the last time he'd ever see that place, or if he was just another name to be swallowed by the jungle. They moved through the dense underbrush, the air thick with the scent of earth and decaying leaves. The forest closed around them, its towering trees and creeping vines creating a labyrinth that seemed to have no beginning or end. The path the stranger had spoken of was invisible to Ben. But the man moved with purpose, carving a trail through the wilderness as though he knew exactly where he was going. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but there was no relief. The humidity weighed on Ben like a suffocating blanket, and his body was already beginning to ache from the strain of moving through the thick, tangled foliage. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the jungle itself was aware of their every step. Eventually, the stranger stopped abruptly, holding up a hand for Ben to halt. He turned to Ben, his face taut with concentration. "Look at the ground," the stranger said, his voice low. Ben dropped to his knees, scanning the forest floor. At first, everything seemed the same, mud, moss, and fallen leaves, but then he noticed something, faint markings on the trunks of the trees. Slashes, scratches, subtle and almost invisible at first glance. They were so small that he could have easily missed them if he hadn't been looking closely. "The path," Ben whispered. "These marks. They're leading us somewhere." The stranger nodded grimly. "They lead to a clearing. But don't be fooled, it's not safe. Nothing out here is what it seems." Ben didn't ask what the clearing was. He didn't need to. He had come to understand that the forest wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, capable of shifting, adapting to whoever walked through it. There was no true escape. Not really. The forest would give you just enough hope, just enough light to make you think you could survive, and then it would pull you under, like quicksand, dragging you back into its depths. But they had come this far, and Ben knew that there was no turning back now. No matter what awaited them in the clearing, they had to see it through. The price of survival was steep, but Ben had learned something in his time out here. Survival wasn't just about enduring the jungle. It was about making a choice, and sticking to it, no matter the cost. They pressed on, following the markings, until at last, the trees began to thin out, revealing a small clearing bathed in dappled sunlight. It was beautiful in an unsettling way, the kind of beauty that made you uneasy. The air here felt different, lighter. It was as if they had crossed some invisible threshold, stepping out of one world and into another. The stranger stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the space with suspicion. "It's not over yet," he muttered. Ben looked around, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever came next. But he knew one thing for certain: survival was about more than just escaping the jungle. It was about facing what lay beneath the surface, understanding that the cost of survival wasn't always something you could outrun. With that realization hanging heavily in the air, Ben and the stranger stepped into the clearing, where the real test would begin. The jungle may have let them through for now, but they weren't free. Not yet.